So good evening everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Oxford Centre for Life Writing. Whether you're joining us online or here at Walton College, it's wonderful to have you with us. My name is Illyria and I'm the events manager here and a researcher at the Centre. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar, OCLU, as it is affectionately known, is a research centre where writers, academics and anybody interested in life writing can come to write, research and think about how lives are represented, remembered and imagined. And we are delighted to say that we are celebrating our 15th anniversary this year. And as you can see from our term card on your seats, I should say, we have a wealth of events and opportunities on offer here. Over the next week alone, our workshops, seminars and lectures will cover topics ranging from obituary writing to documenting the life of one of Britain's most prominent Jewish female photographers. And we encourage you to join in and support our work in this, our anniversary year. This evening we're delighted to welcome award-winning filmmaker Saeed Taji Farouky. Before I share his great and many accomplishments, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our Global Majority and Underrepresented Life Writing programme, of which tonight's lecture is part. The programme offers scholarships to 8 brilliant, unpublished writers from around the world, and many of them are joining us online this evening. We provide the teaching, mentorship and practical guidance they need to hone their craft and advance their careers as writers. The programme also offers opportunities for leading global majority and underrepresented life writers like Saeed to share their work and perspectives. The programme is currently unfunded, and as part of our anniversary celebrations, we're asking for your support to secure the programme's future. So if you are able, please do support a scholar or an event like this one by donating online or via the QR code that will be shown at the end of the lecture and all through the wine reception. Or you can just come and have a chat with me about the programme if you're interested. And now for the main event. So, in this evening's lecture, Saeed will draw on his experiences as a filmmaker and educator to examine the possibilities and difficulties of producing life writing when the very materials of cultural memory are under threat. Saeed's award-winning work explores topics including conflict, human rights, and the legacies of colonialism. His documentaries include 1,000 Fires and Tell Spring Not to Come This Year. He's also the founder of the London-based Radical Film School, a free course supporting political filmmakers from marginalised backgrounds. Before I hand over, as ever, we remind you that the topics discussed by our speaker this evening may be of sensitive nature. Our centre is committed to upholding respectful and inclusive environments, and our events are spaces for openness, curiosity and care. And we thank you in advance for helping us maintain that during tonight's discussion. And please know that if you would like to take a break any time, you are very welcome to do so, and there's quiet seating available over there in Wilson's Cafe. And on that note, thank you very much and welcome, Saeed.
Good, thanks a lot. Thank you so much for the invitation and for everyone coming here tonight. When you are staring genocide in the face every day, whether in Palestine or here, watching genocide remotely, and also watching simultaneously the most basic fundamentals of democracy in this country undermined, seeing some of the most extreme suppression of the right to freedom of speech, to freedom of expression, to freedom of dissent that I've seen in my life, it can be very difficult to know why you still create art. It can be very difficult to know how to create art, what the purpose is. I think one of the reasons for this cognitive dissonance for a lot of people is that we are raised, especially in this country, to think of art and culture as separate from politics. It is, to my mind, one of the legacies of the radical neoliberalization of culture in this country, that it should be a commodity to be bought and sold, and therefore has to be seen as separate to politics. At best, it can reflect a personal experience or a personal emotional response to politics, but it cannot be, or at least is not allowed to be, a political act in and of itself. In Palestinian culture, art, music, cinema, literature have been acts of political resistance for generations. We can look at Palestinian folklore, which discusses a very long-standing connection between humans and their land. We can look at, for example, the protest songs that were written about leaders of the 1936 Palestinian revolt. We can look at the cinema of the Palestinian, what's called the revolutionary period, roughly 1968 to 1982. I'll discuss that a bit in a few minutes. And we can look at what I think is a resurgence in this sort of radical, or some people would say militant form of Palestinian art today. There's never been a question that those two are very closely linked. And in fact, intrinsically linked. They are the same process. That the production of art and the sharing of art and the exhibition of art is a political act in and of itself, and must be a political act for Palestinians. My introduction to this approach, or to this philosophy, you might say, is what's called the Palestine Film Unit. So I'll start with the first slide here, should be the logo of the Palestine Film Unit. We'll see if we can figure it out. Oh yeah, okay. Oh, I just clicked it. All right, cool, got it. So that's the logo of the Palestine Film Unit. It's an AK-47 combined with a film camera. So the founding philosophy of the Palestine Film Unit, and the Palestine Film Unit, which was founded in 1968, explicitly as the filmmaking arm of the Palestinian resistance. And the founding ideology is that these were not objective documentary filmmakers. These were not people trying to represent the Palestinian armed resistance. They were participating in the armed resistance, but holding a camera instead of a gun. So from the founding of the PFU, they established a core of Palestinian art, cinema in particular, that was militant in and of itself. So it's not an expression or a reflection of militancy, but it is militancy, the making of the film. And as we'll see in a minute, it's everything: the conception, the making of, the exhibition. Every aspect of the process must be a political act. At the same time, they were also devising a new vernacular form of Palestinian cinema. So they realized that in order to make cinema a militant act, they couldn't simply adopt the cinema of Hollywood, for example. They couldn't simply adopt the cinema of the European New Wave. They couldn't simply adopt the narrative structures of European art forms, because those structures had within them also the seeds of colonialism. And those structures were in fact used within colonialism to justify, to extend colonialism into other parts of the world. Cinema and the industrial age of colonialism, in fact, developed within about 10 years of each other and became very closely linked for many decades, to the point where the core, in fact, the birth of documentary cinema, emerged from cameramen accompanying armies in their colonial conquests. So the makers of Palestinian cinema understood that these two things had to be delinked. So they chose somehow to completely deconstruct European narrative and construct a form of communication that they could define as purely Palestinian. So I'm going to show you a clip from one of the films that I sort of consider a perfect exemplar of this period of revolutionary cinema. It's called They Do Not Exist. It was directed by one of the co-founders of the Palestine Film Unit, Mustafa Abu Ali, in 1974. This is roughly 3 minutes that I'll show you here. I hope this So do I just click it again?
Yes, if you hover your mouse on the video, then click it.
All right.
It should hopefully.
Okay.
أرسل لك يا أخي العزيز هدية بسيطة منشفة أتمنى أن تعجبك كان بدي أرسل لك شيء أحسن بس هاي اللي قدرت عليه أنتم بتستاهلوا أيها الأبطال أحسن شيء في الدنيا لأنكم فدتون عن أرواحكم في سبيل فلسطين وأخيرا سلامي لجميع الفدائيين الأبطال و100,000 السلام سلام من أخوة الصغار والكبار والسلام تكان أختك عايدة الشيخ مخيم نبطية.
أثبت وقائع التاريخ أن الإمبريالية لا تتردد عن ارتكاب أي جريمة للحفاظ على مصالحها، كما أنها لن تتورع لحظة واحدة عن إبادة شعب كامل فيما لو تعارضت تلك المصالح مع وجود هذا الشعب.
In this clip a number of techniques that maybe are more familiar today, but really represent a very experimental form of cinema for the time. And then some more ideological decisions. So the first scene you see is a very humanizing representation of the Palestinian feda'in, the resistance fighters. The letter from a young woman who's given them, a young girl who's sent them a gift. Even the way that the two men interact is very, is very affectionate. It's an attempt to humanize a type of person that was, for the most part, represented as a terrorist, as a violent person. You see the direct address, so someone who represents the filmmaker speaking directly to the audience, almost dictating ideology directly to them. You see these various chapter headings, right? The film has, in my mind, found a way to relate to genocide through the vocabulary of the film itself. That is to say, if all aspects of Palestine have been torn apart, if the country itself is fragmented, if the people themselves are distant and fragmented, then surely the language of cinema itself should be fragmented, should be in pieces, should be perhaps difficult to read or difficult to decipher. And then you have the moment with sort of a network of international solidarity where they compare the genocide of the Palestinians, and it's important to recognize the use of the word genocide even here as far back as 1974, and comparing it to other genocides around the world to put the Palestinians into a solidarity movement with those peoples. And at the end, a short scene that uses this counterpoint, the Israeli Air Force bombing a refugee camp to the sound of Bach, as if to say that this is the European culture that you claim is civilized, right? This is the end point of your so-called civilized culture. So there are a lot of techniques here that are used in various ways throughout different types of militant cinema. But the important thing for me is to understand how these techniques are developed specifically, both to show a response, well, to show the effects of and to show a reaction to the genocide. So it's not only a cinema that's interested in reflecting the pain and suffering of the Palestinians, although that is paramount, but it's also a cinema that is not shy to offer its solution, and in this case its solution is armed resistance, very clearly defined as armed resistance. So this movement of the Palestine Film Unit was influenced by a broader historical movement called Third Cinema. Third Cinema really emerged, at least a particular type of Third Cinema, from South America in the late 1960s, also dealing with a state of emergency. In the case of Third Cinema, we can sort of say the benchmark event was the military coup in Argentina. And what's interesting about Third Cinema, it really laid the foundations for a type of radical cinema that still exists today, foundations that I use in my own work, and I know many of my students have absorbed, used in their own work. So the first principle is that radical or militant cinema is about the process and not the product. So the process of making the film, again, as a political act, is much more important than the finished film itself. And in fact, a lot of militant cinema embraces what's sometimes called imperfect cinema. So in other words, the technique should not be of importance. The quality is not really important. The image quality is not so important. It's not about producing beauty, but it's about producing a process of resistance and a process of solidarity. The second is that it should be collective and not individual. So many of these films, including the PFU, although we attribute them to individual directors, were made as collectives, were not attributed in their time. These days, many of these films are distributed freely. So it's not about paying the director or giving the director credit. It's about disseminating the work as much as possible. And the third, perhaps the most important fundamental principle of militant cinema, is that it inspires and instigates political action. So it's not a cinema that's just trying to evoke emotion or tell a story. It's a cinema that expects you to watch the film and then leave the cinema and go out and take action. Right? There has to be a very distinct connection between the film itself and a form of political action. So this, one of the... Wait, now how do I get to the next one? Here, this thing? All right, now I got it. Fernando Solanas was one of the, I don't want to say founders necessarily, but made one of the first films that's considered a benchmark in Third Cinema. I'll just give you a practical example so you understand what I'm describing with Third Cinema. He co-directed a film called The Hour of the Furnaces that was about resistance to the dictatorship in Argentina. Every step of the making of that film was a subversive act. So they filmed with rebel fighters, resistance fighters. The filming itself was done illegally, clandestinely. The material had to be smuggled, to be processed, had to be edited in secret. Then when the film was shown, of course it was still during the dictatorship itself, so the film had to be shown underground. It was not shown in commercial cinemas, but in clubs, in universities, and wherever it could be shown. And when they showed the film, it was not the sanctity of the cinema that we might recognize today. They would show the film, and they would continually stop it to discuss what was going on screen. So, for example, they might show a street battle, and someone who was in the street battle would volunteer information about what it was like. Then they would describe a strategy, and someone else might suggest a different strategy, and they might come up with a new way of running a street battle. Someone else might have new information. They would create new networks of solidarity. They would create new units of resistance through the making of the film. So in this way you can see what I mean by every step of the process is a political act and an act of resistance in and of itself. If we go even further back, before Third Cinema, I think we find what I would consider, at least for me, the real principles of this idea of art as a form of resistance. And for this we look at the work of Ghassan Kanafani. So Ghassan Kanafani was, oh no, that's not Ghassan Kanafani. That's genre good art. All right, I'll give you the good art quote. Sorry. There's a couple of quotes that I find really instructive that I think are really useful for this way of thinking of cinema. The first is Godard, who was since the 1960s very dedicated and publicly dedicated to the Palestinian cause. And I always find it really instructive on how our culture has changed, how cinema has changed in a number of ways. That, for example, Godard could easily go to the Cannes Film Festival and say in public, I support the armed Palestinian resistance and I made a film with them, and here it is. Today that would be absolutely impossible. Right? There's no way you would be imprisoned. I certainly would be in Guantanamo Bay by this point. So the prospect of showing your solidarity with armed resistance and making a film about it and having it in a major film festival is unthinkable today. But anyway, in a 2005 interview, he put his philosophy very succinctly. When he says the problem is not to make political cinema, the problem is to make cinema politically. So what he means by that is that we're not talking about the subject of a film. It would be very easy for me to make a film about workers' rights and everyone is working 18-hour days and underpaid and I treat them badly and no one's remunerated properly. Right? That would be a film that is political cinema, but it's not cinema politically. Because the film itself doesn't embody the values of the subject. So what he's saying is that the making of the film must be political, not merely the subject. Then if we look outside of the film world, and this for me is where it really starts to become interesting, is when we see revolutionary leaders themselves who understand the centrality of culture to the resistance and even to anti-imperialism in general. So this is the Bissau-Guinean, Cape Verdean revolutionary leader, Cabral. And he said in one of his speeches, I think it was around 1972, if imperialist domination has the vital need to practice cultural oppression, national liberation is necessarily an act of culture. So what he recognizes here also is that imperialism necessarily requires the destruction of the indigenous culture in order to survive. And in some cases, the replacement. So when we talk about particularly Zionist settler colonialism, we're talking about the replacement, not just the destruction of Palestinian culture. So Ghassan Kanafani in 1966 wrote Resistance Literature, which is a book that describes his approach to using art as a form of resistance. In his case, literature. He was a poet, a playwright, an editor, and the leader of the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. And he identified, I think, or I find in his writing, 4 key points to what it means to make art as a form of resistance. And why, in fact, art can be a form of resistance. So the first is that it offers a counter-narrative. So he identifies the fact that Zionism has to create a mythology of its own in order to succeed, and that mythology is created in many ways through literature, and to that we can include also cinema. So he says if the enemy is creating their own narratives through literature and cinema, we must do the same with our narratives. So it becomes the construction of a counter-narrative. That for him is a form of resistance. The second is that it asserts the cultural continuity of the Palestinian people. And now one of the fundamentals, again, that Zionism relies on, their motto, a land without people for a people without a land, or the denial of Palestinian culture or even identity at all, necessitates that they deny the existence of Palestinian culture. So simply by asserting it, like Kanafani does, you are resisting the extermination of your people. The third is that it creates compelling narratives that people need in times of crisis. Not only to be inspired, but also to follow much more specifically. I don't tend to use the term hero because it's very singular. What we're talking about is a collective movement. But it is essentially that we need heroes in order to resist occupation, resist genocide, or in this country, resist the dissolution of our rights to protest. So literature does that. Literature can construct those hero narratives. And the fourth is that Zionism itself focused on the destruction of Palestinian culture since its earliest days. So in the 1930s and 40s, it was very common for Zionist militias to raid a house, mostly prominent Palestinians, and steal their library, steal their photos, steal their maps. Now, many of those then became incorporated into Israel's national institutions. But Kanafani understands that they identified culture as an arena of warfare, and so we need to respond by also identifying culture as an arena of warfare. And that persists today, right? It's probably even more prominent today. The fact that Israel will intentionally assassinate poets, filmmakers, right? That they will intentionally invade and destroy the Jenin Freedom Theatre. They have always identified Palestinian culture as in need of being destroyed. One, because it's a source of resistance, but two, because it insists on the continuity of Palestinian existence. So in this perspective, the idea of culture as an arena of warfare, Palestinian cinema has a very unusual wound in that the film archive that the Palestine Film Unit established in 1968 and moved to Beirut was stolen in 1982 when the Israeli military pulled out. It's known to this day that it is in the hands of the Israeli military, but they've never acknowledged it and never returned it. Now, the main archivist of the Palestine Film Unit, a woman named Khadija Habashni, estimates that around 80% of that archive has been recovered in one way or another. Sometimes through original footage, quite rarely, but more often through a digibeta recording that a television station had used in the 1980s, or VHS that someone recorded online from TV. But every so often, you know, someone in Italy whose grandfather was the head of the local chapter of the Communist Party will find a roll of film in his attic and they realize it's a missing film. Because what the PFU did at the time when they made a film was they would make 20, 30 copies and distribute them to their solidarity networks around the world. So Khadija Habashna estimates 80% has been rediscovered, but it does not constitute a singular archive anymore. It's not a stack of film in a building the way it was in Beirut in 1982. It is a decentralized archive. And even more so, it's what the Palestinian film scholar Karim Astafan calls an embodied archive, because he argues that all of us carry those elements around with us. So now that I have a clip from They Do Not Exist on my laptop, that means my laptop is part of the Palestine Film Archive. And now that you've seen it and you carry those images around with you, it means that you are also now part of the embodied Palestine Film Archive. So when Palestinians now are making cinema, they understand that we are not just communicating our pain to the world, we are not just communicating forms of resistance to the world, but we're also reconstituting the archive that was stolen. The archive that is and will in future also become the visual heritage of Palestine. In this way, it's really an adoption of the philosophy of Osman Sembène. Osman Sembène is sort of considered the godfather of African cinema. Senegalese filmmaker who always described his films looking in two directions at the same time. He said that half of my gaze is towards the past, is towards France's crimes of imperialism in Africa. But the important thing is that the other half is looking towards what is the future of an independent country? What do I want to contribute to the identity of my nation? So militant cinema is always looking in those two directions at the same time. And in fact, it has to be, otherwise all it becomes is a reflection of the pain of the past, and that's not enough. So I want to show you, maybe as we wrap it up, I'll show you 2 clips of works of mine that I've tried to embody these principles in various ways. The first one is kind of silly, but you know, it's not a film either, but it's based on a film. It's based on a film of Ghassan Kanafani. But I'm a strong believer in the fact that every revolution needs some silly acts of joy and collective laughter to keep us sane, to keep us alive. In 1970, Ghassan Kanafani gave a very famous interview to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. If you look at it online, you'll find it, it's legendary because it shows his charisma, it shows his mastery of the language, but it also shows that he was never willing to compromise in interviews. And it's become, there are several quotes from it that have become quite legendary, but in fact it shows his resistance to being pushed into a corner by fairly arrogant foreign journalists. So at the Open City Documentary Festival 2 years ago, I held an event called Kanafani Karaoke. I've been trying to integrate militant karaoke into my work for a few years. The philosophy being that, firstly, karaoke is a very English thing that I'm fascinated by, and it has a very special role in English culture, which I think can be used very well. The other is that it's collective, it's fun, generally, not always, it depends how good you are at singing, but it should be fun. And it offers people the opportunity to play a role. This is the important part. So Kanafani Karaoke, people were invited to sign up on a clipboard as though it were a karaoke event. But when their turn came up, firstly they were able to wear a jacket that looks like Ghassan Kanafani's jacket. He had a very distinct bomber jacket. And then they were to play the role of Ghassan Kanafani. So instead of the lyrics of a song, they had the dialogue from the interview. And they would play the role of Ghassan Kanafani giving the interview. And the reason for this, there were several. The first is that people are very nervous about using revolutionary language, especially now. I mean, this was still the case in 2024, but now when even specific words are being criminalized, so the word intifada in a particular context could be criminalized in this country. The Prime Minister even suggested that the phrase "from the river to the sea" might be criminalized, right? So we're in a very, very dark era of banning of particular phrases. But the point is, people are very nervous about the use of those phrases. And what you're able to do by playing the role of Kanafani is practice the use of that vocabulary, right? Someone who is uncompromising in his vision, who can say without hesitation, revolution, liberation, enemy. That's very important for people to be able to say in public. The second is that it allows people to dissent collectively, to share that dissent with others around them. That helps us feel more secure, but it also creates new networks of solidarity amongst people who are strangers when they show up to the karaoke. And finally, it's a form of quite passive political education. People might show up knowing nothing about Ghassan Kanafani or knowing a little about Ghassan Kanafani, but through this process you learn more about him. The second I want to show you is a film I'm sort of in the middle of making now. And I'll describe the background of it and then I'll show you a short trailer. But during my trial for direct action against Israeli weapons manufacturer, the judge and the prosecutor were continually interrupting me, disallowing me from saying certain things. So I could not discuss the history of my Palestinian family. I could not discuss our displacement. I could not discuss the fact that the building of my family is now a weapons research center in Israel. I could not discuss the past, the historical record of Elbit Systems, the company that I was protesting about. So I was silenced, constantly interrupted. And at the end of the trial, I was found guilty, of course, but for weeks I could not get over this feeling of humiliation and guilt. That at my own trial, really the only opportunity I had to confront the state with what I had done, that I was being disallowed from speaking. And the only way I found to escape from it, because I'm a filmmaker, was that I imagined myself in a film role saying the things I wish I could have said. Right? I imagined myself in the sort of climax of a courtroom drama where I didn't listen to the judge and I said whatever I had to say anyway, and everyone cheers and I step outside to a big crowd of fans, and you know, that's what helped me feel better about myself. And I suddenly thought, what if I shared that experience with other people? So I conceived of this project. And in this project, I brought a bunch of other protesters who had been arrested for pro-Palestinian activities. And they built the set together, a very rough recreation of first the police interview room and then a courtroom. And then they would perform, like I had done in my head, they would perform an idealized version of their interviews or their trials, where they say the thing that they weren't allowed to say. So it became, firstly, this very cathartic experience, very emotional experience. It also became a way, again, like Kanafani karaoke, for them to practice the language of resistance, to practice speaking even when the judge or the police tells you not to. Then it was also a great way of creating new networks of solidarity, because this event was open to the public, so people could walk in, help us build the set together, watch the filming. Sometimes they played members of the jury. And these people would talk to the protesters at the same time, understand how they were working, how did they protest. If they shut down a weapons factory, how did they do it? So you're also sharing strategies at the same time. And finally, it reveals the parts of the justice system that are mostly hidden from view. Right? Nobody knows what a police interview looks like unless you've been through one. Few people will know what a trial looks like. Fewer still will know what goes on behind the scenes. So this was a way of opening the doors to the courtroom so the public could see it for once. I played the role of the police and the judge, which I hated. It's not fun at all, but there is a bit at the end that it's a disturbing part of a trial. I just want to warn you all. Anyway, it's staged, just to clarify that I'm not really mean. I'm just playing the character of someone who's mean, the judge in this case.
This is my grandfather, also called Saeed Taji Farouky. This orderly looking passport photograph is, in fact, his mugshot, taken in 1939, when he was arrested and imprisoned for 18 months by British authorities for resistance activities against the continued occupation of Palestine. In 2022, I was arrested by British authorities for blockading London offices of Elbit Systems, Israel's largest weapons company. He's only doing. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. All right. So as soon as we start the scenario, I sort of unplanned the role, right? So I can say I will say things that are a bit inconsiderate. I don't feel like I wasn't feeling
I know. But there's something about like I don't want to tell you that. I don't feel I owe you that.
How do you feel when you see videos of dead children in Gaza?
How do you feel when you see videos of dead children?
Are you even listening?
Because it doesn't seem like any of you care at all. You all look so bored.
Mrs. Thorsten Diamond cannot speak directly to the jury.
What about the trial against Tony Blair? A million people were killed in Iraq on a fake war looking for weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. Where is the trial against him? Why aren't any of these people in the dock with me today?
People are dying, and I really can't comprehend that. I don't know how you can comprehend that. I don't know how you can try to control that in your mind, in your heart. Like, do you actually have a heart? Do you have that? Because you're really, that is really, really worrying to me. That in itself is really disgusting.
We can cut that.
No, we can't cut there. Why cut there? Why cut in, why cut there? Is it making you uncomfortable?
That was shot, this is 2 chapters that we filmed of a 5-chapter film. And those 2 chapters were shot in May of 2025. They included the participation of several people who were arrested for direct action with Palestine Action. Now in July of 2025, so 2 months later, Palestine Action was prescribed as a terrorist organization. So suddenly the film itself was really in jeopardy. Right? It wasn't clear if we could continue making the film or if the making of the film itself would be considered a terrorist act. We're still navigating that now, but I think as far as my lawyers are concerned, we have a fairly clear path. We're continuing. I mean, we are still making the film. But nevertheless, it exists in this strange space where it was about a very particular direct action movement in this country and the suppression of the rights of activists in this country, and then itself became the victim of the suppression of the rights of activists in this country. But what it does, at least, it brings us into understanding of now an era we're in which there's really unprecedented suppression of language, right? The very use of words that have become criminal in and of themselves, not just actions, but words. And it's a moment that obviously politically is extremely worrying, but also as a filmmaker or as writers, those of you who are writers, I hope we'll see that when a word becomes criminalized in this context, criminalization that's specifically intended to suppress dissent against the government or suppress our rights to challenge a genocide, I think it becomes our responsibility to use that word, both as a form of resistance, but also to insist on the meaning of that word, on the correct meaning of that word, and the fact that those words should be used because we're in a state of emergency in which we need to resist not only the genocide of the Palestinian people, but also the erosion of our rights here, our rights to protest, our rights to dissent, our rights to language. So I'll leave it there for now. I think we'll see what else comes up in the Q&A. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. You can tell what an amazing educator Saeed is, and I feel really, really privileged of listening to you talk today and you having shared those clips. We normally start off with the moderator asking the first question, but I actually think it's best for us to throw it out to you. I'm sure there are lots of questions. And we've got Charles here with a roving mic. Is there anybody who would like to ask Saeed a question?
Thanks so much, Saeed, for such a compelling presentation, efficient presentation. I wanted to ask you more about the archive as a historian here. Any film, of course, is an act of selection in order to create a narrative flow. Material is cut. You set reference in the film there. And I'm wondering whether, as a radical filmmaker, you also see the obligation to preserve the total archive, because there must be a massive testimony that you have, that you're dealing with, that will be so invaluable to future generations, but also to the narratives of that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the original archive is that it was not just a library of films, but it was also all of the footage that they had amassed.
That's the question, thank you.
And yeah, and what you find is when you watch these old films, and I mean, dozens of these are available online, by the way, so I'd urge people to go look at them. They will reuse footage from those films over and over again. And what's happened now, there's a movement that I call the new militants, right? So we had militant cinema until 1982. There was very little Palestinian cinema, a couple of feature films in the 80s. And then after Oslo, there was sort of a new film industry, which was very uninterested in politics for a number of reasons. One, probably the main reason, is that the only financing they could get was European, and European co-producers didn't want militant cinema anymore, for understandable reasons. So they made much more introspective films. In the 2000s, we started to have access to the old archive online, and people started to see what had happened before, what was being made in the 60s and 70s. And you'll find a lot of new militant films now that reuse again that footage, recontextualize it maybe for a digital era. So it's constantly in flux, and that was one of the advantages of the archive. There's a very big question now whether we should try and reconstitute the archive as a physical archive in one place. We haven't reached an answer yet. I mean, I'm also on the Palestine Film Institute, which is sort of heading one of these projects. We don't have an answer. There's obviously a great advantage to having it decentralized, which is that it can't be stolen again. But there's also a disadvantage, which is that it can't be visited, right? It can't be seen, it can't be touched and felt, it can't be... there is something beautiful about the old film material itself that it was kept on. I'll just tell you, sorry, my answer's going to be a bit long. I'll just tell you an anecdote about They Do Not Exist, which I think exemplifies this. They Do Not Exist was considered lost for a long period of time. And then a number of filmmakers, including Anne-Marie Jasser, who's recently made Palestine 36, the fiction film, discovered a copy of the film and put it back together, did a sort of cleanup of it. And they wanted to show it in Jerusalem because it had never been shown in Jerusalem. And they wanted to invite Mustafa Abu Ali himself. He was still alive at the time. He didn't have permission to enter Jerusalem, as most Palestinians don't, unless you have a Jerusalem ID. But in order to make sure that this was a militant screening, they smuggled Mustafa Abu Ali and the film into Jerusalem so they could both be there simultaneously for the first screening this film ever done. This is around 2005. So, you know, there is something about the materiality of the film itself that I think is quite fascinating. But anyway, for now it's a decentralized archive. We're still not entirely sure what to do with it. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Well, thank you for this really inspiring talk, and clearly there's a lot more we need to know about the history of Palestinian cinema. I wanted to ask you about the extent to which Palestinian cinema can help to reach the different parts of Palestine. I mean, I'm just thinking, if you are 48 Palestinian or 67 Palestinian, or if you are someone who is in the diaspora, presumably you have very different access to resources, funding, production, and so on. How do Palestinian filmmakers relate to this? Is there other spaces for people to build bridges across those different positions? Is there a sense in which Palestinian cinema can help to bring people together across those different, very, very different positionalities and kind of spaces from which film can or cannot be made?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tension now in the fact that, you know, Palestine has something of a film industry, but it's not a sustainable, well-funded film industry. And also, obviously, they're still under occupation, so if you're talking about West Bank, So their access to the material, to the funding is very limited. Even within, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship are also subject to censorship, to state control, etc., etc. So the ironic situation is the Palestinians living abroad, like myself and my other friends here or in France or wherever, have access to European funding. But what it means is that most well-funded Palestinian cinema is made by those living in diaspora or those with access to, right? So it creates a very privileged class of filmmakers. For a while, everyone was okay with that, right? But now I think we're in an era where we realize there's a serious issue there. So we're trying to increase capacity within Palestine itself. That also means if we're on the outside and have foreign funding, working with Palestinians inside as much as possible. But also, exactly like you said, using cinema as a way to not only communicate with the Palestinians there, but also build this shared solidarity, so that we can all see cinema as a form of resistance, right? It's also a move away from what's kind of called the Oslo genre of Palestinian filmmaking, which is where it became very depoliticized, sometimes for good reason, right? I mean, I always say one of the rights of a liberated people is to make boring cinema. We shouldn't only be able to make films about resistance. Now I feel like I have to at this moment, but I mean, that shouldn't be the only option we have. I don't remember how that's relevant to what I was saying before. Funding. Oh yeah, sorry, the Oslo period. So what the Oslo period did was became very introspective and personal, and we got comedies and a whole genre of Palestinians wondering who they were, and films about them not knowing how to make films, and some of it was great, but I mean, it really deviated from the militant path. So now there's a return, I think, to the understanding of militancy, how it has to be, even if it's integrated into a much more conventional drama film, right?
Yeah, so I have two thoughts on my mind while asking the question. One is 1960s poetry of witness, that we had a lot in Istanbul with the underground kind of Armenian poetry movement there. And the other is an exhibition I once saw in Istanbul by the Lebanese filmmaker, maybe theater player, called Rabih Mourwa, who had this gorgeous exhibition called Pixelated Revolution, where he talks about people now shooting their own death, so basically witnessing with their cell phones when they get shot. So there was a genre on YouTube about people from the Syrian Free Army who were shooting basically while they were shot at. And in the context of militant cinema, how is this whole thing about kind of the filming of witness, not the poetry of witness, how does that, would you also consider people, filming atrocities and witnessing, atrocities being done to them also as militant filmmaking and forms of resistance? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense in the context of Gaza. This is really the fundamental challenge for, people in Gaza, but also what do we do with material from Gaza, in the sense that, let's say we decide that we don't only want to show death and destruction, but overwhelmingly what's coming out of Gaza is death and destruction. How do we reconcile those two? But of course we have two different priorities. I, as a filmmaker living outside of Gaza, my priority is not how to stay alive. Their priority is, and if they're going to suffer, their priority is communicating to the world they're suffering. There are also videos of joy, and this is something I find really beautiful. Much more, in a way, much more powerful than the gruesome videos of destruction. What I also find really interesting, and again I struggle to reconcile, is how videos from Gaza have changed as people understand how they're being consumed on social media. Sometimes in ways that are also quite disturbing. In other words, they're being made for the algorithm. The question we have with, say, the Palestine Film Institute is, how do we preserve that, firstly, right? Like, do we make, does that become an archive? And what role does all of that footage play? You know, if we want to show joy and resilience, really, sort of, let's say on the outside, is that a misrepresentation of what people in Gaza are actually going through? Or if we really just want to show the extent of the genocide, the abject sadism of it, are we now exploiting those people's lives, even though they willingly share that with the world? You see what I mean? I don't know the answer to that, but I mean, this is an ongoing debate. So there is really a question of how that's going to constitute the archive of the future, and also how that becomes evidence for war crime trials, right? It's not just a creative archive. It's also an archive of the most widely filmed genocide in history.
So you've mentioned content there. You've also meant that in your talk you also mentioned techniques that you've used, so what I would call sort of critical fabulation, so the reimagining of the circumstances around the court case and your arrest. Are there, and you also focused in the first half of your talk on the techniques that were used by the Palestine Film Unit in order, as part of their resistance. Beyond what you've already discussed, and I suppose, so I've got a twofold question, are the techniques that were used, so fragmentation, is that enough today? What would you add to what you've already discussed? What are the techniques of resistant film today?
I think, what the PFU filmmakers were trying to do, first it was just deal with how to represent what they were experiencing. And with the knowledge, some of them, were fans, so their relationship with Godard was two-way, by the way. So they were, Mustafa Abu Ali studied in London, had seen, knew Godard's work, was a fan of Godard. Godard then became a fan of Mustafa Abu Ali. So they were familiar with European structures. They were also familiar with the fact that they just weren't enough. They couldn't adequately reflect the Palestinian state of being. And they were also, I think, consciously rejecting them because of their association with European powers, with Hollywood, with whatever. But technique is never enough, and maybe the short answer is technique is never enough, right? What's enough is what you do with it. But the other thing we're seeing now in the sort of non-militant cinema, because of the vastly different political climate, is that by making this fragmentation and by using the obscurity of an art installation or an art video, we're also able to offer ourselves a level of protection. So we sort of have to take the fragmentation of the 60s and 70s to an extreme where it's almost incomprehensible. Now, I would argue that still reflects the Palestinian, right? In the state of genocide, this state of genocide, where there is no rationality, where I can't look at it and logically understand it, the only kind of film that can make are films that are illogical and non-linear, But also, we have to do that to protect ourselves from being arrested. We can't say what they said in the 1960s and 70s anymore. So we have to find those techniques and then take them to the extreme. And I think that's one of the reasons why mostly the militant form of cinema now exists in installations and art galleries. It exists in the artist's moving image space rather than in a cinema. Because it just simply couldn't exist in a cinema. I'm trying, it's fucking hard, right? Nobody's gonna fund it, if you're making militant cinema today. So I think that's the solution. That's what the new militants have found as a solution.
So what do you teach your students at the Radical Film School?
Well, most of them, thankfully, most of them are really not interested in showing in a cinema. You know, they're much more interested in founding their own collectives and projecting their work on the side of a prison, you know, for example, or showing it in a community center, or so partly we select, you know, quite radical people, but it's also partly, I mean, everyone in the film school is from some sort of marginalized background. The film industry in this country has been so decimated over the last 20 years that firstly, anyone with a radical bent has almost no interest in it because it's so commodified and mainstream and commercial, it's just utterly unappealing to them. But it's also totally inaccessible, right? I'm just about comfortable in a room of the sort of British film industry, but my students who are 20 years younger than me and you know, face way more intersectional marginality, they don't feel welcome in these spaces at all. The funding structures are not creative, they're not risk-taking at all. So it took me 20 years to realize that I was never going to exist in that world. But the students that come into my school, they've known that their whole lives. So they're much more interested in creating parallel institutions anyway. And our theory, I mean, some of us are working inside the industry kind of trying to, you know, I don't really believe in putting a lot of effort into slowly changing it, because I just don't have the time and resources. Some of us are, but our theory is that we show the industry that we reject it, so it becomes less and less relevant. We're doing our radical work on the sides, and every once in a while the industry sort of looks over and says, oh, that's really interesting. What are you working on over there? So we're seeing that now. We're being invited into institutions because, of course, they desperately want what those students have, which is like something radical, something to say. They care about what they're making. They have a reason for doing it. It's about their real-lived experiences. They're taking risks. All of these things that the film industry claims it wants, but really has no space for at all.
Might be said the same said for academia. My opinion, not yours, please. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you. You partly answered the question I was going to ask, which was regarding collaboration with non-Palestinian filmmakers. And it happens there have been a couple of releases in the UK and I imagine in other European countries of films involving collaboration. So No Other Land is one case, and more recently one of them is The Voice of Hindu Rajab with a Tunisian director. And I just wondered if there are places you do see some scope for those kind of collaborations, perhaps including, as with No Other Land, with a Jewish-Israeli partner. Is there anything there?
Yeah, there has to be collaboration. No Other Land is complicated. There's issues with the Israeli director's position on Zionism. I'm not sure I want to get into it right now. I think it's a good film. I'm critical of it. I think the Israeli director is also going through his own political journey. So it's not a simple case. But anyway, look, there has to be collaboration. It has to be done properly. This is the second part of this. Right? There has to be collaboration because the Palestinian cause is not just about Palestine. And we're seeing that here, again, I don't want to turn this into a political speech, but I mean, the systems that build drones that are bombing people in Gaza also build the drones that monitor the English Channel for migrants. The companies that build the CCTV cameras and facial recognition cameras that cover every inch of Palestine are now being used here in this country. The Israeli military thankfully lost, but tried a bid for a contract to train the British military. Right? There are dozens of Elbit sites in this country producing Israeli weapons for the British military. So Palestinian liberation is also liberation in this country. Is also freedom from tyranny in this country. So ideologically there has to be solidarity. The other thing is I just looked to the past as my guide, and again, in the Palestinian Film Archive, you'll see dozens of films listed as Palestinian films, and they're made by Jordanians, Lebanese, Syrians, and then later Swedish people, Americans, Germans, but they're still considered Palestinian films. So there is solidarity there, there has to be, but it has to be done properly. And what properly means, and that's a much larger discussion, but I mean, it has to be made in real solidarity with the Palestinian people, aligned with the priorities of the Palestinian people, and ideally made with Palestinian people.
Thank you. Sorry, this is a question that winds our way back to aesthetics, which seems a bit clumsy after your last comment, so I apologise for that. I'm really interested in how you were framing the fragment as inherently anti-aesthetic, or perhaps anti-aesthetic, and I wondered if it'd be interesting to pause over that and ask if there can be an aesthetics of fragmentation. And the place I'm coming from in answering the question is actually thinking about Black feminist theory and the way in which a scholarship of slavery has centred the fragment as the only archival residue that we have, and attempted to do forms of whole interpretation through that commitment to the fragment. And so it feels like there's a potential, at least in literary form, to imagine fragmentation as beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is one of the problems I have with edited cinema, is that sometimes it looks awful, right? I mean, these are great films, but they're not always good films, if you see what I mean. I'm very into beauty in cinema. So, you know, I also don't make that many militant films. Most of my films, I would say, are very pretentious art house and very into beauty and aesthetics. So I admire that world a lot, and you know, I admire the Kanafani's ideology and his approach. The third cinema people would totally reject the idea of art for art's sake and beauty. I mean, they were very specific about imperfect cinema and even ugly cinema sometimes intentionally, also because they were mostly anti-capitalist, and so they saw aesthetic cinema as capitalist, and by making something ugly they could, I mean, all that stuff is very influential on me, but I do also like art. I do also like beauty. And Kanafani was in between those two worlds. I mean, he always said he didn't believe in art for art's sake, but he did also make beautiful work. I mean, and by that I mean, you know, work that's manipulates emotion in a way that we read and we appreciate as craft. So I do think craft can work with all of these theories. I don't think it has to be exclusive. But I guess the definition for me is that it shouldn't be the primary. I mean, it shouldn't be the primary in any art form, to be honest, but especially in political or radical cinema, it should never be the primary concern. So yes, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. There is space for it. And another way of looking at it is because there's a scarcity of that material. So I mean, with the Palestinians, of course, the archive is gone. That we should have the right and maybe even the privilege to care very gently for this material, which means working with it, you know, with love and care and trying to make something beautiful out of it. And again, if we're subjected to so much cruelty, a natural response might be to create something beautiful. So, but for me, it always has to be married to this idea of militancy in the sense of like inspire or activating political action, not purely activating emotions.
So we're coming to the end of our time, so we've got time for one more question.
Are there people? I thought there were people online. No?
Yes, we've got one more.
Okay, so we've got a question online, so it's from a person saying, how do you respond to institutions that claim neutrality while actively excluding political work, especially when silence and refusal themselves are political?
How do I respond? Not very well. That's the best answer. I mean, honestly, this, you know, since the start of this phase of the genocide in Gaza, I think we've seen the worst betrayal of the values of art and culture from British institutions in my lifetime. You know, incredible hypocrisy, incredible fear and cowardice, and at worst, an abandonment of the Palestinian people. You know, so film festivals that made their careers off of the work of me and my colleagues. I mean, you know, mine is sort of marginal, but friends of mine, for example, from Gaza, who've risked their lives to make films, whose festivals have used those films to create their reputation. And then when we asked for the most basic form of solidarity or statement or alignment, they refused. So it's been a real slap in the face. I mean, probably it's just revealing what was always there. I just hadn't seen it before. A lot of it, I mean, in their defense, and not that I really want to defend them, but I mean, just to take more of an objective look at it, I think the majority of it is driven by fear, and it's a fear of, you know, how the Zionist pressures in this country will respond if you show solidarity with Palestinians. It's a fear that politicians will react so badly that they'll pull funding. You know, it's a fear that you'll be investigated by the Arts Council or the Charity Commission. I'm not sure what's worse, you know, an institution that just doesn't care, or an institution that will say to me in a private meeting, oh, you know, I love what you're doing and I really support the Palestinian people, I just can't say it publicly, but, you know, that to me is almost worse. So in each case, they've, I think, undermined the very principles of the institutions themselves. So what it means to me is that we have to build new institutions. I think that's the only solution. You know, there are some that I think we probably have to allow to fail, you know. Whenever, like with the Palestine Film Institute, we do a lot of engaging with institutions, either on a particular basis, something's canceled or censored or whatever, or, you know, sometimes they come to us and say, can you help us form a screening of Palestinian films or change our policy or whatever. Anyway, very often with those that don't want to comply or they don't want to help collaborate with us, their response will be, well, if we call this a genocide, we might lose funding. You know, and my only response is if your festival requires denying a genocide in order to survive, it probably doesn't deserve to exist. You know, I'm not going to lose sleep if the Berlin Film Festival ceases to exist tomorrow. It's a shame, but is it worth denying genocide over? Absolutely not. And that's probably what's needed for us to then create institutions that aren't going to deny genocide in the future. And like I said at the very beginning, you know, this is not just a sort of academic conversation, because we also have to see cinema, like any form of culture, as part of not only the suppression of Palestinian people, but also the war. You know, film festivals have been producing propaganda for decades. They're not neutral. And this idea of neutrality, you know, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this idea, but if you're neutral in the face of something like a genocide, then you support the status quo. The status quo is this country is participating in the genocide. So it's not neutral. And finally, I don't want to pick on other countries because everyone has the right to their own resistance movement, but I really qualify these days that, you know, we have to be very specific. It's not that they want art without politics, it's that they want art without Palestine. Because they're very happy to use the politics of the liberation of Iranian women. They're very happy to use the politics of the resistance in Ukraine. But when it comes to Palestine, there's always an exception. So they're exploiting all of those, of course, for their own means. But it's not as easy, it's not as easy as saying they don't want politics and culture. It's very, you know, we're seeing new legislation on a monthly basis specifically about Palestine, specifically about the protests for the liberation of Palestine. So this is not just a general depoliticization of culture, it's very specific. It will become general, of course, and that's what we're constantly warning people. Again, that's why I say the liberation of Palestine is also your liberation. But for now, at least, it's specifically focused on Palestine and concepts of Palestinian liberation. I don't know, that I went off a bit. Did that answer the question? Okay.
I think that's a very poignant place to end or wrap up this evening's conversation, just for now. Thank you so much. Please join us. We're going to have, there'll be a wine reception at the back. Continue chatting. And please do join us at our future events. We'd love to welcome you. So just a huge round of applause to Saeed. Thank you.